freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I am, as always, your host, Nico Perino, and today I'm joined by Chris Ferguson. He is a professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida. His research and clinical work explore many issues, including crime, violence, and antisocial behavior. He's written and researched on the impact of media on viewers, including violent video games. We actually interviewed his co-author of Moral Combat, Patrick Markey, over at Villanova, I believe, right, Chris?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was it seems like forever ago because it was pre-COVID that I interviewed him, but it was really only like the end of 2019. But that was an interesting conversation. I encourage our listeners to go back and check that out. But you've also done research on sex in the media and suicide-themed media, and you've authored a number of books, including the aforementioned Moral Combat, but the most recent one is How Madness Shaped History, an eccentric array of maniacal rulers, raving narcissists, and psychotic visionaries. And I apologize, I messed up your cover here a little bit because I read it by the pool yesterday. And it started to fray, but it was a fascinating read, Chris, because I'm a history major, and you usually don't get this sort of perspective on history. I mean, it was a good history book on its own, but you also take a look at the psychology of these people who create a lot of the history that, who wrote a lot of our history. What was the impetus for looking at that?
Yeah, and I was going to say, by the way, you have to buy a whole new book now that you got water on the cover. So
you gave me this one for free.
I don't make them up, That's just how it goes. But I love history. It's part of the impetus. Is I just wanted to write a book that was fun for me and that I thought would be fun for other people to read as well. But a lot of it came from, I had read, sort of like Jared Diamond's like Guns, Germs, and Steel, and a lot of other books are kind of in that same vein. The zeitgeist seemed to be over the last few years or maybe a decade or more, was this sort of idea that sort of like the main drivers of history were these kind of like environmental forces, so that if the West became prominent beginning during the Enlightenment age, that was an accident of geography, that the correct, combination of geographical resources and absence or presence of plagues and things like that, and where war kind of came in and where it didn't, that just happened to be a lucky combination that allowed, sort of European communities to rise and become dominant in the Enlightenment era. And there was a de-emphasis on the sort of the more traditional sort of like great person hypothesis.
I was going to say, yeah.
The idea that, like without George Washington, that the American Revolution would have failed, So the sort of Guns, Germs, and Steel argument would be that like George Washington is largely superfluous. Some other dude would have stepped in and kind of like filled the same role, or, a group of dudes or dudettes or whatever, would have stepped in and did the same thing. And I think there's something to that. I mean, I really wasn't, writing a book to sort of oppose that. I think there are a lot of credible aspects to that, that viewpoint. But I
think it's myopic a little bit. And you point out the case of Winston Churchill, of course. I'm fairly confident that Britain wouldn't have won that war and would have coalesced or fallen into place if it weren't for him. I mean, all the forces save one, Winston Churchill, were arguing for diplomacy and some sort of compromise with Hitler.
Yeah, absolutely. Had Neville Chamberlain remained, prime minister, following the invasion of Poland, or I think who else was it, Attlee that they were looking at one point,
or Halifax,
yeah, exactly. That would the outcome have been the same? Because there was kind of some vibe of once particularly France fell during World War II, that this is kind of looking bad, it's looking hopeless, so they benefited from, certainly. I mean, of course, we could always do counterfactuals and what would history have looked like had Winston Churchill not existed, but they certainly benefited from an individual who was able to steel them up and give them morale and give them the grit, for lack of a better word, to persevere through some of the darkest moments of the Battle of Britain in in World War II. So yeah, I mean, there is this element of either for good or for evil that individuals do matter, and of course we make that, or at least those of us that are sort of on the left are making that argument right now about like COVID-19, and of course we don't know counterfactually what the pandemic would have looked like in the United States in 2020 had Hillary Clinton been president, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this sort of suspicion that it would have looked somewhat different. It wouldn't have been great. I think everybody would say that there still would have been a pandemic and it would have been bad. But are there a certain percentage of lives that would have been saved had we had someone different in a leadership role? I don't know. But that is sort of speaking to this idea that individuals do matter, and the actions of people who are in charge of our societies can have an influence on how things turn out for us, either for good or for bad. It just was more fun for me to write about the bad ones.
Well, it's hard to imagine that whether you had Mao or not, you would get the Great Leap Forward, right? It just doesn't seem that the whole argument, and I'm sure, like everything, nature versus nurture, the environment versus the great man theory. It's all a factor, but again, without Mao Zedong, I don't know that you get the 20th century China that you saw, or without Hitler, I'm not sure you get the Germany that you saw, or without Steve Jobs, I'm not sure you get the iPhone. So that sort of argument to me is, I have to take it with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is trying. I mean, my hope was kind of to try to bring things back a little bit towards, like you're saying, like it's not that the guns, germs, and steel argument is wrong. It isn't. It's just that it's one piece of the puzzle, and that individuals can matter as well. And on occasion, individuals can have outsized dramatic impact on how their societies function or don't function, depending upon how they themselves are functioning in some situations.
Yeah, so you take a look at a lot of the maniacal and narcissistic rulers in your book, and you have this quote. You say, human societies have evolved, developed codified laws, accepted that kings and queens are not above them, and developed bureaucratic checks and balances to prevent power from being centralized on any one mad personality. So I want to ask, because it's those sort of checks and balances that have prevented these maniacal rulers from censoring or killing on a whim. Do those moments come in a unique moment of sanity for society? Like the idea that we put in these checks and balances, do they have to come at a unique moment? Is the state of nature the Hobbesian one, where we're all kind of fighting amongst many with each other? I guess, is it unique? Is it to be expected that we get these codified laws, or is the madman or mad woman the state of nature?
Yeah, I mean, again, at the risk of oversimplifying somewhat, the sort of default, if you will, is probably the mad person, way of. So, historically, power has largely been centralized, at least during sort of developed, post-agricultural revolution societies. So this idea that, and we could say certainly even modern democracies have power differentials. We're not living in Whoville, at this point in time. So I don't want to necessarily suggest, there's this, utopia that we're now living in. But there is a sort of tendency for people who drift into powerful positions for one reason or another to try to accumulate power, and so this idea that power should be spread out is really weird in history. It's
why the American Revolution was so unique, right?
Yeah, it was. It absolutely was. And of course the American Revolution itself capitalized on sort of like political and humanitarian. Humanitarian, God, I can't speak today, thought that had been evolving, for, really decades or even a century or two beforehand, the humanist movement that had evolved out of the Enlightenment. So it's not like, the founders just like off the top of their heads thought of this stuff. They were influenced by other philosophers and stuff. But there did seem to be that confluence of that sort of philosophy of thought was existent. It was coming to some prominence. and you had a group of leaders who were at least willing to consider it, and again, I don't necessarily want to cast the founders as complete, um, what would the word for it be? I mean, there still were
Angels.
yeah, exactly. I mean, they still had, this idea, at least some of them, like John Adams, of course, were worried about the public and the common person, and with possibly some good reason. So they
the
weren't
public, right? Weren't they, to a certain extent, they would have given Washington the kingship if he wanted it.
Yeah.
And why not, right? He seemed like a good guy, and that's all humanity had known throughout history, right? Was these sort of autocratic rulers, and you just hoped you got a benevolent one.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And he had to kind of demonstrate himself as being this sort of, benevolent ruler. So there was this kind of movement to, enthrone kind of a president for life, essentially, in the early republic. And it was fortunate that he basically played this role of Cincinnatus, from the Roman Republic, of basically turning down power when it was offered to him. So that was a very fortunate. So there again, you have an individual that had Washington and made a different choice and decided to go for some sort of president for life, which, if I remember, was something that was on the table as an idea for a while there. If he had gone for that or pushed for that, then that might be what we were faced with still today. He would have set that precedent for that.
And even though we didn't get that, I mean, you still get some of the imagery that might suggest that he were a godlike or king-like figure. You go into the Capitol Dome and you see the apotheosis of Washington. He's sitting on a chair in the heavens, lording over all us little people looking up at him. It's hard to think that you would do that for one of your presidents today, like put Donald Trump up in the Capitol Dome or Joe Biden up in the Capitol. Yeah, it's just even silly to entertain that, but they did that. We're
just kind of glad he can tie his own shoes at this point, but
yeah, glad of
I'll be mean
just get the job done. But even some of these people who were informed by the Enlightenment had that urge to censor. I mean, we look at John Adams and the Sedition Act, and although Thomas Jefferson freed those people who were imprisoned under the Sedition Act, when he became president, he was prone to censorship as well. Have you ever thought about the psychology of censorship? Is the default state of nature to shut up our critics, to shut up our enemies? Yes. and what type of person does it take to overcome that?
Self-aware. I mean, it's so most people. I mean, although I'm seeing more people now who will kind of come right out and say that they're not free speech advocates. So I've heard, sometimes, I've had that conversation where I say, well, if you really believe in free speech, and I say, well, no, I don't believe in free speech. Oh, okay. Well, at least we've established that.
Yeah.
All right. Fair enough. Okay. Yeah. We are in agreement then that you are not arguing in favor of free speech. So there seems,
which is always a weird argument, because then it's what are you in favor of? Might makes right. Whoever holds the levers of power determines what is free and what is not. But usually get a more nuanced argument than that. They'll say, I'm. But anyway,
I'm in favor of free speech, but is usually the argument
you'll get what many free speech advocates call the buttheads.
Well, I mean, I guess that is that kind of argument that comes out of, I know, like the big fight now is over like CRT and like even like Delgado kind of had that sense of free speech as being sort of an aspect of oppressive. It benefits the oppressors in society and that sort of stuff. So I think probably people are kind of coming from some version of that view of unfettered speech benefits the powerful kind of a viewpoint, which is kind of the opposite of true, but but I understand why sometimes people think that.
Yeah, and there's a whole slew of theorists, including the author of Repressive Tolerance. Why is his name? I've mentioned his name a million times on this podcast. Who argue that you sort of need to censor in order to create a tolerance within society, and that full tolerance is repressive, like tolerating differing points of view if they result in differential treatment or perhaps differential treatment can be repressive.
Yeah, but I think there is this kind of innate
Marcuse. That's who I. That's it.
Okay.
Marcuse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is this kind of innate tendency for us to, again, it comes down, I mean, there is something to this idea of power, so, and of course, information and speech and communication is all about power. So there is this sense of when we're in some sort of debate that, yeah, we kind of want to shut the other side up, and it can be frustrating, to come across people. And I've felt it, so I understand it, so that's why I sort of say, like, and I try to resist, pat myself on the back and that kind of
Mhm.
stuff. But, it does take a certain sense of like, ooh, I'm getting frustrated by this other person's argument, but they have the right to make it, and if I want to convince them or others that my argument is right, I need to come up with some information or facts or data. And but while at the same time supporting this other person's ability to have a platform, to have an opportunity to speak. And that can be very difficult, I think, for a lot of people. And like I said, I mean, I have felt the inclination at times where it's like, oh, wow, that
Well, it's
argument's
just
really
easier.
dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, it's just easier, right? Because you don't have to
Yeah.
do the work. And if you have all the weapons behind you, you're one of these eccentric or maniacal rulers that you write about in your book. It's
Yeah.
fairly easy to do, but there's a question as to whether it's effective.
Mm.
Is it actually affecting the sort of result that you want to shut
Yeah.
people up? Do the ideas disappear? I think it's hard to kind of know exactly how effective that is, because if the censorship works and the ideas do disappear, we probably wouldn't know about them, right?
Right. Yeah.
This sort of censorship would probably need to be all encompassing in order to not let them leak out. I think you probably get some of that in North Korea, or maybe a
Mhm.
little bit during the rule of Mao Zedong, but tactically, I mean, at least in modern times, it ends up making martyrs out of those you're trying to censor. And of course, if your goal is truth discovery, then you lose a lot by shutting people up.
Right. Yeah. Well, there again, I think that for a lot of people, the goal isn't truth discovery. I think that there's we construct worldviews, right? We have
Mhm.
these sort of narratives about how the world works, whether they're religious or political, or anything else. And our inclination is to be hostile towards anything. In psychology, we have the idea of confirmation bias or my
Mhm.
side bias, which are kind of related ideas. And so the gist of it is that when we have, a piece of information that supports our worldview, we tend to soft pedal it. We tend to not question it
Mhm.
for the most part. And when we come across a piece of information that conflicts with our worldview, we usually aren't very curious about it. The ideal, of course, is to be curious, is to say, well, I used to think this thing was true, um, but um, but I'm sort of curious to find out if it's not. And particularly if it's something we're emotionally invested in, there is this element of like emotional and moral investment in things that makes
Mhm.
things harder. If we're emotionally and morally invested in a particular worldview, or we have our reputation, like it's the Ferguson theory of everything, and then a piece of data comes by, and says that if I've got a book that says something is true and somebody else comes out with information that says my book is wrong, well, I still want people to buy my book, so I can't just back down and say, I mean, the ideal is that I would, right? The ideal is I say, hey, yeah, I thought this was true. People should stop buying my book. And I think there's one or two examples of authors who have actually done that, but they are very, very rare. The human inclination is actually to sort of dig in one's feet and say like there must be something wrong with the source. I just had a little Facebook debate today. It wasn't acrimonious or anything, but it was over the protests in Cuba,
Mhm.
and this one person was saying that this was all like a CIA plot to like instigate these protests, and somehow it was going to like result in like the U.S. was going to invade Venezuela. I don't know how they got from Cuba to Venezuela, but nonetheless,
Mhm. Probably
uh,
by boat and then by land.
yeah, I'm not sure how that, but I kind of, I don't know. I honestly don't know anything about the politics of Cuba, or more than the average person, I suppose. But I sort of went and looked at, like, I found a survey was done, I think, by the University of Chicago, and they actually managed to survey Cubans, and the data was, said like 54% of Cubans would move out of Cuba if they had the opportunity to do so, and most of them would move to the U.S. And I said, well, what do you think about this? And the reply was like, well, that comes from the University of Chicago, which is like this imperialist, you know, CIA funded. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they did.
No, I know. I get the gist of what they're probably trying to get at. Yeah, and I can probably imagine how that conversation went from there.
Yeah.
But the this idea of confirmation bias, and it's a very, I'm assuming, very recognized concept within the field of psychology. Does the field of psychology do a good job of moderating that within itself? Like,
No.
because I think about Jonathan Haidt, right? And
Yeah.
you know, social psychology and the sort of work that he does. And I remember he told this story. He went to some sort of conference and he asked people to raise their hands if they were conservative, you know, pretty much anything other than liberal, and no one raised their hands. You know, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. It might just mean that they're fearful to raise their hands in an environment where everyone is elsewhere. But if you'd think in a field like psychology, which is your field, you would understand these innate biases and then would create like some sorts of institutional disconfirmation to fight against them. But it sounds like the it is very strong within psychology.
It's a very id-driven field. Yeah, but absolutely true that, you know, I mean, so I'm on the left. I'm a pretty liberal person. You know, I've voted for Biden and Obama, and I don't think I've ever voted for a Republican for any major office. But you know, most people in academia, and certainly including psychology, it now feels like they're to the left of me. You know, I'm probably you know, the closest, you know, as a sort of Clinton.
Well, you're a neoliberal there,
Biden
Chris.
voting, yeah. I'm the conservative now on campus. You know, so, but no, I mean, and it comes right from the top. And we have an organization, the American Psychological Association, that I was on the Council of Representatives for 3 years. So I got to see how some of it functions on the inside. And it's not a science organization. I mean, you know, so people mistake. It's a guild, you know, which is fine, you know, because
there's room for that.
Yeah, people like myself, we pay money every year. You know, I'm a member, and you know, it's supposed to represent our profession. You know, but it's not a science organization. So watching like these things. So first off, you know, as counselors, as council members, we were typically asked to vote on things. We had no idea what, you know, we had no personal information about whether this thing was true or not. But a lot of them were politically loaded, you know, sorts of issues. So it tends to function. I mean, first off, it's a marketing firm for psychology is what it is, but it also tends to function because most of the members are pretty far on the left, certainly much further on the left than the average person in the general public. It tends to function as kind of a quasi, you know, progressive organization, you know, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing, except that it's supposed to be science, right? You know, and if it is only taking, you know, left or far left views on issues and does so quite often. I used to make the joke that, you know, President Trump couldn't fart without the APA releasing a statement opposing it. And, you know, so if it's that kind of.
And has the APA always been like, because you saw you've seen, especially in the last 5 years, the politicization of a lot of these apolitical organizations issuing statements on things that you 10 years ago would have never issued a statement on because it was outside the mission. Is that, I mean, I imagine you've been a member, or at least watched it for a long time. Have you seen that trend towards politicization in recent memory? And this maybe gets into a little bit of the polarization discussion that you have in your book too.
It's gotten more so, I would say. I think it's always been somewhat of an issue for the API, at least going back several decades, I would say. You know, so I mean, you know,
you see it with like the MLA and the Modern Language Association too, and a lot of these other associations. I mean, it's their right to do it. It's just a question of whether it corrupts science.
Yeah, whether it's a good idea, you know, and I guess short term maybe it is, you know, but long term is a bit more questionable. But yeah, I mean, of course, the APA's had long issues with policy statements like on the violence in video games that I did that is you know, has not been accurate for quite some time. But in the sense of sort of like everything politicians do, suddenly the APA has to talk about it. Yeah, that feels a little. The frequency seems to have gone up, you know, and I think part of it for the APA is in 2015, they kind of got, I'm going to tell a short version of the story, but eventually they got caught, if you will, changing their ethics laws to allow psychologists to be involved in the torture of detainees in Guantanamo Bay. So that was a massive humiliation for the APA. They basically sort of collaborated with the Bush administration and eventually the Obama administration to sort of allow some of this stuff to happen. And, you know, I mean, of course, for an organization that's supposed to be ethical, and sets the ethical guidelines for our field, to then be sort of caught out doing some of this stuff was pretty bad. I mean, it was. So I think as a consequence, we also have this idea that comes out of Freudian psychoanalysis, reaction formation, which is when you start doing the exact opposite thing of what you're naughty. So in other words, you cheat on your wife, you come home and you bring her a bunch of flowers and a new Volkswagen. Or Volkswagen's a terrible car.
I don't think that's going to help. I don't think that's going to help. Yeah. That was like
the
Volkswagen's the poor man's BMW.
Was absolutely incorrect. BMW. Yeah. So you only feel a little guilty if it's a Volkswagen. So I think to some degree, I think the APA is trying to show how just, with a capital J, the organization is, even though they really haven't changed much. That sort of the internal workings. My impression of the internal workings of the APA is that they're still a very bureaucratic, fiefdom that is still basically a marketing firm for and runs like a marketing firm for psychology. And even that might be a little generous.
But is there any recognition that that there is a danger in the lack of diversity that exists, at least ideological diversity that exists within the field or within all fields? I mean, we have this general concern in America and the world right now for science. All the science and all the studies seem to indicate that a lack of ideological diversity produces extremes on any end of the spectrum, depending on where the echo chamber exists. But there seems to be very little interest in doing anything about it. And science would suffer as a result.
I fully agree. No, and I think, of course, working in academia, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, have been eye-opening to some extent. So I before my current institution, I worked at a state school in Texas, on the border of Mexico. In fact, I was in Laredo, Texas, and so I was kind of familiar with some of the politics around. It was Republican administration in Texas. The state legislature was highly Republican and pretty hostile to academia. And then at that point, if we all were liberals. There was there were a few conservatives, but they were a sprinkling among a field of liberals. But for the most part, it felt like I think that it felt like the conservative legislature was exaggerating the degree to which we were indoctrinating kids. That was always kind of like the language, that we were indoctrinating kids. Now, I mean, that was probably like 2005 through 2013 that I was working there. Now, I kind of agree that at least what's happening to some degree. I'm not saying that the conservatives aren't exaggerating it at all, but now I would have a difficult time disagreeing with the idea that at least some indoctrination is occurring at universities, and that some students are being pressured into taking positions that they may not think are true, or they're not being presented with all the evidence, both for and against a particular viewpoint, and such. So, and I would say to raise that as an issue invites itself a fair amount of pushback, and that's okay. Pushback is okay, but there is this kind of fear, particularly in the last year, that that could result in a job loss or some other official sanctions or something of that sort for speaking on the record, or getting caught speaking off the record about some of these issues. So I think there is a palpable fear in academia, not to say K through 12 also possibly, about deviating from this orthodox, from an orthodox position, or even speaking about the idea of diversity in education. Most people don't care about it, and I think there even have been these surveys that have come out that have suggested that particularly younger scholars are much more okay actively discriminating against a job applicant who was, for instance, more conservative, and that's that's not good.
No. I mean, you try and create these guardrails within institutions when you notice phenomena like that, right? In order to check them. You have this in grading procedures. You do blind grading. You don't know whose paper you're grading, for example. You would think you would after a while, after you see all the research, Cass Sunstein's and others' research on the importance of ideological diversity to avoid extremism, which is a worldwide problem and phenomenon at this point, that the scientists would come up with some sort of solution, and there would be some sort of care to implement it. But I only see it getting worse, right? The question of indoctrination, which you bring up, is an interesting one, and is obviously hot button right now because you see it with a lot of the critical race theory discussions, which are fraught and have so much nuance that's being avoided that it's hard to even scratch the surface of it. But we're dealing with a situation right now at the University of Oklahoma where they have these writing instructors who are training faculty. These are mandatory trainings. You don't have to attend this particular training, but this is one of 9 trainings. And if you're a graduate student, you have to attend 2 of them. If you're adjunct faculty, you have to attend 1. And they were essentially teaching faculty members how to guide their students towards the right perspective. There's like this one quote from this instructor who says, this is how you respond to a student who might be entertaining the idea of listening to a problematic argument. And then they even go so far as to say, if the student is still wanting to write about the pronoun debate, for example, or is using any white supremacist sources or expressing any white supremacist ideas, which it's hard to know what they mean about that. But in some quarters, that could mean supporting the police. It could mean, X, Y, or Z conservative position. Then you report them for a student code of conduct violation.
Ouch. Oh,
yeah. And that literally what she said. One of the faculty members said, no, I just try and have a conversation with them about it. And the other faculty member given the training said, I'm not so kind. Essentially, I tell them they can't explore those topics, and if they continue to do it, then I report them for a student code of conduct violation.
Wow.
Yeah, you should. We put up the full write up on it, so people can. We got a statement from the AAUP at Oklahoma condemning us for it, and they say that the classes that they're training these instructors for are meant to, quote, explore multiple sides of an issue, or, quote, explore an issue from multiple sides, whether their initial position is progressive or conservative, which. I like to be charitable, but that's gaslighting to the 10th degree. I mean, that's not what that training was. The training was to push people to a progressive mindset, and progressive topics, and label anything that wasn't essentially white supremacy. And you kind of talk about that a little bit in your book as a tactic in today's polarized debates is nobody's listening to each other because they'll, on the left, they'll call you a racist or a sexist or a white supremacist. On the right, you have, you're banning you're calling everything critical race theory and banning it and manipulating curricula. Which, the indoctrination debate is, to a certain extent, a lot of this is happening in K through 12, right? That's where a lot of the concerns of in K through 12 education, unfortunately, for better or worse, and maybe necessarily, is an enterprise, almost an indoctrination. I remember growing up, and having to take, a Constitution class, and we were taught all about patriotism, but at least in the higher ed environment, that's not what the purpose is.
Correct.
I mean, it's about the creation, dissemination, and preservation of knowledge, all of which kind of indoctrination is the antithesis of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess if you're teaching like values, I mean, there is a sort of sense of education has always been partially about teaching values as well as facts, but it's kind of the sense of if you're kind of teaching civics, if you will, like free speech is important or due process is important. That's different if you're sort of obfuscating actual facts, So I think that there's the classic book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, right? The sort of sense of sometimes teachers would teach you something about the one that springs to mind is Helen Keller, right? Who is this icon of pushing for the rights for people with blindness and deafness, physical disabilities,
disabilities,
and she also was like a raging socialist, and usually people leave out the raging socialist part and just point, some people say communist. I don't know if it's fair to call her a communist or not. I'm not super familiar with her biography, but
this is a whole nother discussion. Can we separate, the different components of an individual? I mean, Henry Ford was a raging anti-Semite,
absolutely, yeah.
But he also created the,
in a capital R, not like by the modern definition, like just out there, segregationist, so, but on the other hand, he's usually ranked as a pretty, a successful, high ranking, president. But there's no question in his case that he was, an avowed racist, and such. And again, so we should,
and also a subject in your book, right? You're talking about Wilson here. Yeah.
yeah. He's an interesting fellow. He hit on a really interesting point in history. And he is this sort of interesting, like counterfactual, like what if he didn't have, high blood pressure? Would he have had those strokes? And, and would the world look different if only he had maintained his functioning, in the last years of his presidency? But, I think we can be honest with, I think that's the trick is, to argue, here's kind of what happened, and history's messy and crappy things happen. And here's kind of like the larger context of why things happen. But I think what we have with history, particularly in K through 12 and in university, is again these competing worldviews, and the conservatives want to tell the utopian story of American history, whereas for some reason the left have just like completely jumped off into this dystopian version of American history without any redemption. It's kind of like the Howard Zim, school of history. That was an interesting. I don't know if you ever read Howard Zim's
The People's History of the United States.
Yeah,
I haven't read the whole thing. No.
There was a clear decision, and the United States chose exactly the wrong decision at every turn. It was like 400 pages of that. So I think there is this kind of fight where both sides. I'm a both sides-erist, are kind of trying to obfuscate pieces of fact or information that are not supportive of their worldview, and they want to kind of enforce it. They kind of want their version to be the one that gets taught to kids.
Yeah, but there is a environment, and this is kind of the Enlightenment environment that I'm in favor of. You talk about values in higher education. The values that we advocate for at FIRE are very much Enlightenment values. You could have, and Jonathan Haidt talks about this, you could have an environment that you could have a social justice university, as Haidt puts it, if you want. You just got to be open and honest about it. We're kind of advocates for the Enlightenment model, which is the discovery, creation, and preservation of knowledge. And in any environment like that, there are certain values which do a better job of pursuing that mission than other values. Thought reform, indoctrination, censorship aren't great knowledge generating values in the same way the other ones are. But
and you can see, the interesting thing for me over the last, again, decade or so, and I think it started on the right more in fairness, and I think the left have sort of followed along with that, is even debates about these values. And because you can see these arguments about, like, take free speech, which I think I would agree with you is sort of a fundamental value that is best for everybody. And you'll see both on the left and the right arguments say that's not true, and that in fact we need to restrict people's access to speech, and it's for their own good. It's always comes into the sense of it's not for the powerful. We're trying to protect the children, or the disadvantaged, or whatever else, or even due process. That we,
you talk about that a little bit in your book too. Yeah,
the sense of like, again, you see it on both sides. There's a sense of, if someone didn't commit the crime, why were they arrested? That's not evidence. That's not how you decide if someone's guilty of a crime.
But that's the psychology that you find throughout human history, right? As a rush to judgment, you find you find that people, when they're so certain that someone is guilty, they don't want to put in the processes to ensure the just outcome. If you go into the Department of Justice today, and everyone has differing opinions about the Department of Justice, but above their library, and I'll never forget it, they have this beautiful mural of a judge with the Book of Laws holding out his hand as a mob and skeletons start racing up the courthouse steps, and there's this man who's crawling up the steps, clearly who was being chased by the mob. Again, this gets back to the first quote that I put out there is we codify these bureaucratic processes to fight against our psychological instincts. And our psychological instincts are not friendly to free speech. They're not friendly to deep due process. They're not friendly to really the rights of any man or woman, right? And that's why I think the last 300 years of human history is so special, because it's been able to recognize through, Enlightenment values and an Enlightenment inquisitiveness that, these life is better if you put checks on human instinct. But this might be the forever fight that'll never be won, because you're fighting against human nature, and you talk about tribalism in your book and the innate instinct we have to separate into our tribes. You talk about one of the great studies, and maybe if you could wax poetic on this, is that one about not the school children, the camping children, the children at the camps.
The Robber's Cave, I think.
Yeah.
Basically with that, again, sort of short version of it, is that they took some kids, and I don't remember exactly how old they were, but they were, sort of 10, 11, somewhere in that range. I believe they were all boys, and just randomly assigned them into two separate camps. And they had I think they were like the Eagles, and I forget what the other one was called, the Coyotes or something like that. They basically gave them animal names. And they had no contact with each other whatsoever, at least initially. They just were in two separate camps for a while. And then they started to bring them into competitive contact with each other. So remember, they were randomly assigned. They knew that they were randomly assigned, as far as that can be internalized into a boy's head, at least, But they knew that they weren't picked because they were smarter or braver or stronger or anything of that sort. But then they started to bring these two camps into contact with each other competitively. So in other words, they would compete at tug of war, and whichever side won would get some sort of, small prize or something of that sort. And very quickly you end up with people the boys start to think well, the Coyotes, they're all idiots, they're all wussies, they're all bad, they're all evil, So you see how prejudice develops as a context of this sort of intergroup conflict. And then what they do at the very end of it is they eventually then bring the two groups together cooperatively. And I think it was something like there was a truck that was broken down, and the truck had food that they both needed for their camps. And so they had to work together to effectively push the truck, to get it to where they could actually benefit from the food. I may be mangling some of the details, but that was kind of what happened. And at that point, once you see that the two camps worked cooperatively with each other, then that prejudice kind of diminished, went away. They had more positive views of the boys on the other side. They're kind of oh, you guys aren't so bad after all.
Is that a solution then to our polarization? And you actually talk about this. You talk about how external threats that can have a way of pulling people together. You look at 9/11 and all the American flags that were hung around, but you'd think that COVID-19 might have been that moment, but it's only supercharged the tribal instincts and the polarization.
Yeah, it suggests that there are certainly some complexities. I mean, if you kind of think of diversity training, I mean, the evidence we have in diversity training, which is kind of complicated, but it basically suggests that the stuff that works best tends to be the stuff that brings people together cooperatively. And
Mm-hmm.
develops, the idea of separating people into different affinity groups, and then, using the more divisive language that some, the white fragility kind of programs of Robin DiAngelo don't seem to work. If anything, they seem to actually backfire, which we would expect, given these kind of results in the Robbers Cave experiment. But but it does suggest that, there are some obvious nuances and stuff, around things COVID-19 didn't work. And I remember 9/11, it was the opposite, because 9/11, it was, if anything, to use the buzzword problematic, it was problematic that there was so much groupthink, around, because that led to some serious errors, that there was no questioning of the government, or very little, very few people were. There was a sort of sense of you're not patriotic if you're not, if you question the war in Iraq, you're somehow not supporting the troops. So there was a lot of groupthink and pressure to conform around that. But it did result in this, cohesive national identity. And if you look at things like race relations, back in the 2000s, they were pretty good. That both Black and white Americans, the majority of Black and white Americans, 60, 70%, 75%, were largely satisfied with how race relations were progressing at that time. and and events like World War II are kind of similar to that. You can see people now coalesce, in some, all the debate kind of goes away, even World War One to a somewhat lesser extent. But yeah, but maybe it needs to be other humans. I don't know. I mean, I'm just speculating at this point. We don't have good data on this, but maybe the missing element is that we didn't have a bad guy with COVID-19. It's just a
Yeah.
virus. Nobody's at fault.
Well, if you're on the right, you have Fauci. If you're on the left, you have Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of stuff really did become, 2020 was really for me this sort of eye-opening experience and just how irrational people really are. And I mean smart people with PhDs. That's the kind of people that I'm, are in my social circle, for better or for worse. You can say I have a limited social circle. That's probably true. But they're smart people. At least they have, a lot of them have doctorates, or most of them are at least college educated, for sure. And their responses were irrational, completely irrational.
Well, if you say, that's another interesting topic in social psychology, is like how we've sorted ourselves. You don't have as much intermingling between different age groups as you used to. We're sorting ourselves along education levels, and various other. And Charles Murray wrote a book coming. You can't cite Charles Murray anymore, but he wrote "Coming Apart." About the various. So that can probably develop the same sort of extremism that we've been talking about for this conversation as well. Just where we choose to live and who we choose to hang out with.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I mean, obviously, there's going along with that, there's a lot of breakdown of just civic organizations. The idea that people who are Republicans and Democrats would all get together at the bowling alley or something like that.
Yeah, the Robert Putnam idea. Yeah,
it's all gone. That's all gone for the most part. It's sort of interesting. I live in a neighborhood that's actually probably unusually diverse in almost every way you can think of it, both racially and politically diverse. And so we actually managed. So we have a Facebook page.
But, we got one in our community too. Yeah.
But actually, I think our neighborhood kind of handled it, because we had people that had like the Trump signs up, and we had people that had the Biden signs up, and this kind of stuff. And we actually managed to navigate that for the most part. I think we kind of came up with the rules that you can have the signs up, but you can't put anything any more divisive. So obviously, there's some censorship for like the better, social good, sort of element. But it's something we all kind of agreed on. So it's sort of like you can have a Trump sign, you can have a Biden sign, but you can't have either like a Black Lives Matter sign or like the blue line,
Yeah.
So kind of like that's the stuff that'll piss people off, and
Are you in a homeowners association, or is it like a voluntary?
Yeah, it's an HOA, but this stuff was mostly voluntary. I think there probably are some HOA rules about what you can post as well.
Yeah, I used to be the president of a homeowners, my old one.
Yeah,
the worst job I've ever had, but
it is. Yeah, I can imagine.
You can never make anyone happy, but we had it written into our bylaws, which makes enforcement easier, because anytime you can avoid any sort of an arbitrary allegation of arbitrary enforcement, the better. But we also, for the broader community that I lived in, had a Facebook group as well. And I moved recently. I moved earlier this year. That community had like 1,000-person Facebook group, and the one I'm in now is like 100-person. And it's very interesting to see how people behave on social media as the size of the group expands. And you expand it even further, and even just look at like Twitter as a whole. People behave, at least in my experience, much more poorly the larger the group is, rather than the smaller the group is, which I guess might be predictable in a certain sense. But you'd think that what you say is on display for a larger group of people, you might behave yourself better, but that's not what I found.
I agree. So there's been this real kind of, because going back 10, 15 years ago, when social media was really just kind of starting, and we were kind of talking about it, there was this sort of sense of the anonymity being to the advantage of the asshole, right? So essentially, like, people who were anonymous would behave badly, and so anonymity was protecting people from consequences. Now, a lot of that is flipped. If you look at, I mean, that still happens, don't get me wrong. But if you look at a lot of bad behavior, it's by non-anonymous people, so people are being assholes still with blue checks next to their name, and stuff like that. So what's interesting about that is now there seems to be social incentive, social credibility that's built around behaving badly, as long as that is sort of appealing to, again, your tribe or your tribalism. So if you say something, ridiculously toxic, but as long as it's like, so you can say stuff that's sexist, for instance, as long as you direct it at J.K. Rowling or Gina Carano or things like that. If you're on the left, you can kind of get away with it,
Yeah, you talked
because
about
they're
the
bad.
Sarah Zhang case, the New York
Yeah.
Times case.
Yeah. So there's kind of like these different standards that apply, to some of this. And again, if you're on the right, you can say something that's, I don't know, horrible. As long as you direct it at, was it like Liz Cheney, I guess now you can say whatever you want about her. She's kind of fallen out of favor on the right, even though she's Republican. But yeah, so as long as the target is the right target, it's kind of like the cliche of, punch a Nazi, right? That assault is bad unless it's like a bad person, then you can assault them, then it's okay.
What do you make of social media in general? I talked with, your co-author on Moral Combat, and he kind of waved away the concerns that my boss Greg Lukianoff put in Coddling, along with Jonathan Haidt, about how social media might be making young people miserable, isn't good for the national discourse, and it's kind of in line with the thinking that you all have on video games, that they're not having that sort of effect on the culture's psyche in the way that a lot of people say they are. Do you continue that line of thinking into social media, or do you think social media is more or less detrimental?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on. I think there are some areas where I probably would agree with Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. I'm always
Lukianoff.
Yeah. And there are probably some areas where I would agree and some areas where I would disagree. And the main area where I would disagree with them, I think, is, and I say this very respectfully.
Of course, this is what we're here for.
Yeah,
disagreement.
but I think, like, there's a lot of this idea of that, like, suicides among teenagers are sort of tied to social media, and I think at this point we just don't see that evidence that can be supported, by the science. First off, the rise in suicides among teenagers is not the most dramatic rise that we've seen in the United States. That's among middle-aged adults, actually.
But you have seen a rise in it among teenagers as well, right?
Among almost all age groups, we've seen a rise in suicide in the last few years. Other than elderly people, is the only group where we have not seen a rise in suicide. But the largest raw numbers and the largest increase was actually seen from middle-aged adults, not the teenagers. So there seems to be something, in my opinion, wider that is happening in society that would explain the suicide rise. We also don't really see it cross nationally. Other countries have, still are high tech adopting, but don't have the same trends in the suicide that we're having in the United States, which is kind of difficult to explain.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
The most compelling argument that they have for their coddling thesis is that the sort of bad behavior that social media encourages, the sort of like reputational catfighting that you get, hits women harder than men, and you see a greater rise in suicides among women than men, or attempted suicides. I think men actually effectuate more of them.
Yes, they do. Yeah, much higher actual suicides among
but
men.
if your thesis is that social media is a contributor to this, social media, just the way women relate to each other, it would seem to have a greater impact on them than it would on men.
Right. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that there's a definite causal relationship. It just
Well, I think what we're seeing is that, and probably the reason that argument came up, is that with teenagers, at least, we are seeing that there has been more of a percentage increase in suicides among teenage girls than boys. Now, there's also probably a certain amount of what we call like a regression to the mean effect, and that the overall numbers of suicides were lower anyway. They had more direction to go in than for boys. But that's probably why. I mean, it feels like a little bit of an ad hoc fit, to some extent. If it had been the opposite, like if boys' suicide rates were increasing faster than girls, there's probably a good reason we could have come up with, well, boys actually behave more aggressively on social media and therefore, are on the receiving end of more of that sort of bullying. Or we could, you can always come up with a reason why the data are inconsistent, but somehow still consistent with our theory. The thing that I would like to, I try to get Jonathan on the record with this one as saying, would you agree if we're using suicide rates going up now to support the idea that social media is responsible for that? Would you therefore agree that if social media rates remained high in the future, but suicide rates declined, that this would also be evidence against your theory? And if they were to say yes, then I would give them a pass, I think. But what we tend to find is that I'm not trying to be like super critical or anything here, but we saw some of the same stuff with video games, that when the data are going in the right direction, people tend to look at that data, and then once the data tends to diverge, then the data don't matter anymore. So that's what I would like to avoid more than anything, is that sort of thing.
So if we're trying to address suicide amongst teenagers or any other age group, it's helpful to determine the causal relationship or relationships, right? So in your mind, what does the science say is contributing to it now? Or do you think it's multiple things?
It's probably multiple things. Yeah. I mean, I don't think you'd find too many people that would say like one thing is causing suicide. And I'm pretty sure that's not.
No, that's not their. No, that's not their.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think anybody's making that particular argument. The question is this thing one of the things that is leading to suicide? So we know that obviously, like family environment, being around people who have committed suicide or try to commit suicide, things like that. Certain types of mental illnesses like depression, of course, and also psychosis, can increase suicide risk. Things like, shame and humiliation are a factor. Bullying is certainly a factor for teenagers.
And I think that's what it really comes down to for them, is the fact that you used to, if you were getting bullied at school, when you went home, you at least had a reprieve. Now you have a social media environment that can bring the bullying home with you. So you get no reprieve. You maybe get a rise in mental illness and self-harm and suicide as a result. I don't know. This is.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair argument. The question becomes, is it empirically supported?
Yeah,
so one of
the
good things that, the good news is that bullying in general has been decreasing over at least the last decade or so. All forms of bullying, whether it's in person or online. Kids in general reporting being bullied less than they were in the early 2000s or late 1990s. So there's kind of been a positive trend in overall exposure to bullying, even with the addition of cyberbullying on top of your regular, garden variety bullying. So the trend lines in bullying, again, seem to be going in the opposite direction than the suicide thing. So, but I think what we need to do is we're kind of, or at least my concern is that we're kind of looking at the elephant, right? And we're all just kind of hanging onto the trunk and trying to describe what that thing is.
Uh-huh.
And that we need to look at the trends in teen suicide in combination with the trends in middle-aged adult suicide and everybody else's, suicide. Because one of the things that we do know is one of the big risk factors for suicide, if you are a teenager, is if a parent commits suicide. So if you have middle-aged adults who are stressed, and I'm about like in 2 weeks to hit 50. So I sort of sympathize with the plight.
Well, happy birthday.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. But I mean, I get it. It is in many ways a stressful period of time. And don't get me wrong. I'm a pretty happy dude. Things are going okay for me for the most part. So I don't want everybody like, oh, Dr. Ferguson saying he's gonna, no, but it is a weird time of life that there is a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and so it's not surprising that we would see middle-aged adults, I think, having more issues, particularly, if you are the cushy academic who's doing who has summers off. It's different than if you're the coal miner who just lost his job, right?
Yeah,
and it has to support a family, and stuff. So I think what we need to look at are how the sort of larger family dynamic is affecting teenagers, because I don't think we can separate teenagers off from these middle-aged adults and say, well, something is happening to teenagers, which maybe is social media, and middle-aged adults are also not doing well, even though they're less tech adopting, and in fact, actually doing worse. But maybe something different is going on there. I mean, I think there's probably some interaction between those two cohorts of individuals, given that one is the parent of the other. And that would be more interesting to look at. I mean, exactly what that thing is, or what those things, plural, may be, I'm not so sure necessarily, other than if you just look around in American society, nobody's happy. At least it seems that way, sometimes. So, I mean, I think there's something larger
If
going
you look
on
at social media, it seems that way.
No, I was gonna say, well, no,
Unless you look at Instagram, then everything's great.
It's all cat videos, yeah,
Yeah.
and people dancing,
Or
But
hanging
no,
out at the beach with their,
what I did want to say is I don't entirely disagree with Greg and Jonathan, though. On the other hand, that I do think there are some risks that come along with social media. I just don't see the evidence for that particular outcome as being an issue. What I do pick up on a little bit, I think there is some empirical evidence for, is the sort of feeding into polarization that we can get with social media. Now, I don't think that the evidence suggests for me that if you took you and me at a certain level of polarization and put us on social media, that we would have a massive increase in how polarized we felt. But what social media does seem to do is amplify people's access to extreme material, and basically the people who are more polarized get amplified in terms of the power of their voices. So my impression, at least, and I'm willing to be challenged on this. I'm not like married to this. I won't say this is the first theory of everything. But my impression is that what's happening is not so much that the average person is becoming more polarized. That might be happening to some degree, but I don't think that's the biggest issue. I think we're giving more power to the most polarized people.
Well, I think there's probably some studies that have been done to determine social media use and, level of extreme views, or even measure. If I sit on last year when the George Floyd protests were happening, I was sitting on Twitter. I'll never forget it because happened to have
Doom
my bachelor
scrolling,
party
yeah.
at the set. Yeah, and I was doom scrolling, and my blood pressure was rising. Right.
Yeah.
As I was seeing all these things happening about these throughout the country, and it's hard to argue that social media wasn't having some sort of psychological, even physiological effect on me.
I fully agree. Yeah.
And you even talk about this a little bit, that just the incentives of social media and the easy access of it, you talk about this in your book, encourage a lot of id, right? Because it used to be if you got angry at something you read, you had to sit down, take out your pen, take out your paper, write up your letter to the editor, and pay the 50 cents for the stamp and put it in the mailbox. Now, 240 characters you can bang out in 20 seconds and then pat yourself on the back and go on with your day. It's just the access to be able to express yourself is easier. And so you see a lot. And this is one of the most disappointing things about social media, and this is getting a little bit off topic to me, is there's a lot of people who I really respected in a pre-social media age who, as soon as their id was unleashed on Twitter, I had much less respect for them. Like, at fear of him coming after me, although we're an hour into this, I doubt I'll listen to it. Nassim Taleb. I mean, he wrote The Black Swan, and he wrote Fooled by Rand, all these great books. Amazing, amazing insights. But he's insufferable to watch on Twitter. All he does is pick fights with people and tell everyone else they're dumb. But that's a whole separate argument. I wanted to ask you on the suicide point. There are communities where, not communities to help people who are seeking to come out of their suicidal depression, but communities that actually help people commit suicide on the internet. And there was that famous case a couple of years ago where I think it was a girlfriend of a guy. The guy was having suicidal thoughts and tendencies, unfortunately, and the girlfriend was not helping him, was actually encouraging him to commit suicide. And eventually he did. I think she was tried and found guilty. In America, we have wide latitude for people to express themselves, even if we find that expression is harmful at the margins. I mean, we allow the anarchist cookbook to be published, for God's sakes, right? How influential are those sorts of communities in pushing people over that very unfortunate edge? How damaging is this sort of expression, these communities that prop up among people who are considering self-harm?
Yeah. That's a great question, and of course the answer is sort of complicated, but I just can't give simple answers. But the area that I'm more familiar with actually is the sort of like anorexia websites, which is kind of a similar sort of issue and debate. And so, the concern there is, of course, that young people, particularly young women, will go on these websites where they're encouraged to develop anorexia, or maintain. There are all these clues about how to hide it from your family and all kinds of other stuff. Um, Challenges about how thin you should be and so on and so forth. And most of us would say like this, this isn't great. The evidence we have again is that for the average young woman goes on the website and it doesn't affect her at all. What does happen is possibly if you have a woman who already, or young woman, teenager or whatever, who already has anorexia, then what can happen sometimes is that if the person feels bad about it, feels guilty about it, maybe guilty is not the right word, but, it has some, cognitive dissonance about it. What is it? I'm trying to think of a psychoanalytic word for it, but basically finding people who are of like mind can reduce inhibitions to something. Sort of reduces the stigma of that.
Well, everyone
thing.
wants to be a part of a community, right?
Right.
But not all communities are good for the self. I mean, you talk about cult leaders in your book,
right? Yeah. Well, people have this thought, identification. That's what I was trying to think of. So people have this idea of like, I'm having this thought. Is it bad? And then you go on, you find someone likable who has the exact same thought, and that convinces you, well, the thought isn't that bad. I guess, the most extreme version of this is, of course, when we used to have, like, what was it, NAMBLA, right? Which is a North America, it was a pedophile organization, right? So people would worry, I think, with legitimacy, like, what if you have a pedophile who feels guilty, as you probably kind of should, and is having these thoughts that, are upsetting. And they say, well, I'm thinking of this, but I also think I'm worried I might hurt someone, and
somebody help me, essentially.
Yes. And what you don't want is for someone to then say, oh, no, it's all good, don't worry about it, because then you may remove that stigma, that you may remove that block that is actually preventing them from doing something harmful. It's not going to be like the average person goes onto this website and is going to say, well, I hadn't thought about suicide before, but now it makes a lot of sense, sort of thing. But someone who's already maybe teetering on that edge, I can't definitively say that, it might not be, but it's not going to be like the technology did. It's going to be connecting with another human being, making that human connection and having that person give some sort of influence that is going to nudge them over the side, is going to argue against whatever barriers they were having, that were preventing them from engaging in that, harmful behavior. And that's what I think there are legitimate concerns around, some of that stuff. What percentage of suicide does that explain? Probably not very much, but, maybe a small amount.
Yeah, I mean, that's I think those sorts of arguments, I think, are the biggest challenges, and of course, encouraging someone to commit suicide, as that case demonstrated, and if the facts bear it out, is a crime. I mean, she was convicted, but it's one of the challenges that free speech advocates have, because you have people who are in distressed psychological states. They find these communities who encourage self-harm or harmful behavior. They have the right, not only the free expression right, but also the free association right to associate around these shared ideas. And we often think that more speech is the counter to bad speech, but these are closed communities, right? There's no disconfirmation happening there. And this is the sort of psychological hack you see throughout history, is people are vulnerable psychologically, and then people exploit it. This is what happened in Weimar Germany. You talk about this in your book too, right? Hitler hacked a vulnerability in German society and drove a big Panzer tank right through it. So the last question I want to ask you is one that I've been flirting with since I took a statistics course in college. I was not a good math student, but I loved statistics because of what it told me about society. And I'll never forget my professor, like the first day of class, he drew the normal curve on the whiteboard. I'll probably butchering the description of it, but it's the curve found throughout society in a bunch of natural phenomena, so like it's low on the edges and then it comes up like a hump and then it comes back down. So you could do it with like the size of babies. Most babies are 7 pounds, so they're up here at the top of the curve. But at the end of the curve, you'll get some 13-pound babies and you'll get some 4-pound babies, right? But you see that all over you see it in the size of tree trunks. You see it in behavior. You see it all over the place. And when he told me this, I started to wonder, are the deviant behaviors that we see all over human history necessarily a part of like, you can never root them out because there will always be that curve, and you can only just shift the curve, but you can't eliminate it. There's always going to be deviance in society. There's always going to be the Mao Zedongs and the Hitlers, and there's always going to be, unfortunately, the people who have schizophrenia or who have suicidal thoughts and ideations, and it created a lot more tolerance on my part. But it also creates a question about free will, which you discuss in your book, is like, if these sorts of people and these sorts of behaviors are found throughout the world and they have to exist almost, you know, what is there left for us to do about it, you know, but accept it?
Yeah.
Have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really complicated one. And I'll try not to go on for like half an hour trying to answer it. But I think there are, a few really interesting, threads. It's important to point out there are some exceptions, of course, to the bell curve. I mean, there's some things like even like violent crime, for instance, this doesn't work on a bell curve. That's all a lopsided, curve. Sexual.
Well, there is like what they call the Pareto Principle. I don't know if that's a example. The idea that like 20% of people are responsible for 80% of the effect, or
yeah.
But maybe you could put that on a bell curve too.
Yeah. But I mean, so part of it, is a sort of concept of like population dynamics. If you kind of think of like a typical trait, and if we accept that most traits have some biological input to them, some genetic input to them, you are by nature going to get a range of those things. That's just kind of, no, we're not going to get like absolute uniformity. And largely speaking, thinking in terms of genetics, you don't want it. If you look at critters that have near uniformity in terms of their behavior, they don't do well for the most part. Koala bears, everybody loves koala bears, but all they eat is eucalyptus leaves. So they're doomed. I mean, they're kind of, I love them.
Yeah, if the eucalyptus leaves no longer exist, they're
that's it. So
Darwin's coming for them.
Yeah, basically, so rigid critters, tend to do less well than critters that have this kind of like wide range of things. Now that does mean you end up sometimes with, take a trait like aggression, right? Which is really kind of the one that, a lot of people are interested in. The aggression works on a bell curve. Most of us are somewhat in the middle. If you like come up to me and poke me in the eye, I probably won't. I mean, I'm a little guy. I don't get any fights because I'll get my ass kicked. But I mean, you know what I mean. But I'm not gonna just like shrug it off. It's like, oh, well, it must have been an accident. But most of us wouldn't hopefully be the one to do the poking in the eye, right? We wouldn't initiate it. So we're somewhere in the middle. And being somewhere in the middle of aggressiveness is probably the most adaptive place under most circumstances which we currently live. You don't want to be too passive. You just get rolled over. And you don't want to be too aggressive because you're a criminal and you'll be thrown in jail. So those are both non-adaptive, sort of extremes on this, bell curve. But that could change, right? So what if the zombies attack? All of the people on the from like 80% down of that curve are going to die. And it's going to be, as the Walking Dead TV series pretty well demonstrated, it's going to be the most aggressive people who are going to survive. And our civilization will look.
I've never even thought about it that way. So, although it's completely obvious, is that the variations in behavior that you find on a bell curve throughout our environment, throughout the world, is an evolutionary necessity for species survival, essentially.
It is, yeah. There's a lot of complexities built into this, but it usually is generally better to have more variation than less. So if we end up creating this utopia where everybody, which I in many ways morally think is a great idea, where we all just get along and we're all peaceful and there's no violence between humans. This all sounds wonderful until the aliens come down and take over, right? You know what I mean? And then it's a terrible idea. Sometimes we have to think about that. The other aspect of it, sort of to address another point about the free will, is that I'm something of a, I guess the word is a compatibilist. That I think that some aspects of free will are compatible with determination and in other areas, and that so the example I sometimes use is that it absolutely is true that our genetics and our environment in many ways shape our behavior, our attitudes, and so on and so forth. We're not complete gossamer angels, making up decisions willy-nilly as we go through the world. So for instance, I probably more than the average person even love donuts. This is absolutely true. And probably a lot of that comes from my genetics. In fact, I have a lot of like weird like taste things and taste aversions and stuff around vegetables and fruit. So I have a terrible diet that I really just can't control. But so being directed towards donuts as opposed to broccoli is probably something that is biologically wired into me, right? On the other hand, I still have the choice to eat that donut or not. So when I make the decision, and I make this decision fairly regularly, should I have a goodie or should I not? I still have some degree of capacity to make a decision. My biology motivates me towards one of those choices. But that's the compatibilist argument, right? There is this determination that sort of directing me towards one outcome more than the other one, but I still have some capacity to make some decision between those two things that we might describe as basically being free will. So if I make the decision to eat the donut, which I often do, that is still my responsibility. I still have made that choice, and I shouldn't just blow it off and be like, well, genetically, I'm an automaton, and if I die early as a consequence, so be it. I never had any choice in the matter.
But there's probably a bell curve and a normal curve for self-control as well.
Impulse control,
yeah, impulse control as well. So
yeah.
if you're at the far, if you're 2 standard deviations away on the tail there, your impulse control isn't going to be good. But someone, based on what we know about bell curves, needs to be on that at that standard deviation. But of course, bell curves can change over time, and the standard deviation, it could shift one direction or the other in the bell. So it's not like there's no control over what that looks like, I guess. But it's something I've always thought about. We could talk about it for an hour. Is just you need to have some sort of tolerance for the extremes, because just the nature of the world is that the extremes are going to always exist, and you can't really eradicate them. But you can create systems. I moved my microphone away. We're not done. But we can create systems to kind of control them and create the right incentives and stuff like. And that's more of Cass Sunstein's work, on nudge and stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say, and of course you have to be realistic about the actual impact. So I think like a lot of the promises of the nudge idea haven't really worked out as well as people had thought. But we're less nudgeable than people had hoped. We are somewhat nudgeable. It's not just, again, it's just a matter of having a certain degree of realistic expectations about how you could. So the idea of like the Brave New World is probably a utopian fantasy or dystopian fantasy, depending on how you look at it. But yeah.
But the nudge thesis. I mean, Cass Sunstein's nudge thesis seems to be a good moderate perspective. I hate to use the phrase social engineering, but that's essentially what they're telling to do. It's like, but it's benevolent in the sense that there's no compulsion. It's like, just like, for example, having you automatically enroll in a 401k and you need to check the box to unenroll in it if you don't want it, rather than putting the burden on you to do the automatic enrollment when you start a new job. Of course, you can get to much less benign subjects.
Yeah, I was going to
say
about that. There's an assumption of benignness. I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah, I mean the civil libertarians, just by their nature, anytime you mention the phrase social engineering, but that's kind of what nudge is, right?
Right, yeah.
Get squeamish, and rightfully so, because social engineering has a horrid history in the world. But
you could see it like stray from that a little bit. I mean, I think kind of going back to free speech issues a little bit too. And I don't know whatever came of it, but I know like in the UK, they were very big on the nudge concept for a while there. There was a movement, well, not a movement. It was actually proposed, legislation essentially that they were going to make it such that when you bought a new computer, that your computer had like a net nanny. It came with like a net filter on. So that basically it would filter out any pornography was the main thing they were looking for. And that, but you could turn it off, but that was the nudge, right? Is that it would sort of nudge you in the direction of not viewing porn as opposed to viewing porn. But who gets to decide that that's the direction we want to, I think, the idea that porn is is inherently harmful is a fairly controversial one. So who gets to decide that this
Yeah,
is
you talk about that a little bit in your book. You talk about how there's an inverse correlation between sexual aggression, rape, sexual assault, and pornography viewing. You have a graph. I had never seen that before. I thought that was fascinating. We could have gotten into the pornography debate in this conversation, but now we're an hour and 20 minutes in, so I think we probably should wrap it up.
Sounds good. Yeah.
This has been a lot of fun. The book is How Madness Shaped History. This came out last year?
Yes, came out right at the beginning of the pandemic, which is the best time to release a book. No, it's the worst possible time to release a book.
I was reading it, and you were writing you talk about how you're writing during the Donald Trump presidency, and for some reason I thought this came out this year, and I was like, reading it, I was like, it must have came out last year. Well, I released a movie during a pandemic, so independent movie, so you can't do film festivals, you can't do distribution's hard, theaters are closed, you can't bring any of your friends to munch on popcorn, so it's solidarity there, brother.
Turns out you can't print books if nobody's working in the place that prints books.
There's no paper
for a while. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the paper shortage is a real deal thing. I mean, there's supply chain issues all over the place. But I remember when Greg was working on Coddling, they couldn't keep up with the supply because they couldn't get paper to bind books. It's like, what? But anyway, the book is How Madness Shaped History. I encourage any history lovers, psychology lovers out there to check it out. Available wherever fine books are sold. Professor Ferguson, this has been a lot of fun. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, awesome. This was fun. Thanks. Appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. This podcast is hosted and produced and recorded by me, Nico Perino, and edited by my colleague, Aaron Reese. You can learn more about this show at Twitter. We're on twitter.com/freespeechtalk. And we're also on Facebook at facebook.com/so-to-speak-podcast. We take feedback, so if you got some, email so-to-speak@thefire.org if you have any for Chris. I can send it along to him as well. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review. Take them on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get the podcasts. They do, believe it or not, help us attract new listeners to the show because we go up in their rankings, which is fun. But until next time, thanks again for listening.